Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland reads for you all. Been a couple weeks since I recorded anything. I had some real life stuff going on, taking care of my parents' house and dog over a weekend, and then also I've been reading a number of things that I wasn't ready to do a reads episode on. I probably will end up, it's a kind of longer series that I wanted to cover the entire thing in one video. So I'll probably end up doing that soon enough. But for today, what we have is not a series, but a book, a single book. Um, Adrienne Mayer's The Poison King, The Life and Legend of Mithradates, Rome's Deadliest Enemy, which is it's a biography of Mithridates, but it also includes a fair bit of other information. Mithridates the sixth, I want to say, I don't remember precisely, but he was the king of Pontus, and fought a number of wars against Roman forces in the area. Um, as the Romans expanded into the territory of modern day Turkey, into Anatolia, they ended up uh, doing a number of different things that raised the ire of local forces, and Mithridates ended up sort of presented as leading something of a larger confederation of different um, groups and kind of national interests, I guess you might say, against Roman forces in the region. He was temporarily successful, but was not successful in the long term. Was eventually defeated by Pompey the Great. Pompey, as in Caesar's enemy, Pompey, Julius Caesar's enemy, and then famously attempted to uh, end his own life at the end of all of these adventures, and was unsuccessful after devouring or presented as unsuccessful after taking a dosage of poison, because he had been an inventor and explorer of all sorts of different poisonous compounds, and the sort of poetic irony, I guess you might say, of this story is that he had developed a tolerance to poison through very, very small doses of it over the course of his life. Specifically, Adrienne Mayer presents the kind of, as it's described as the king of poisons and the poison of kings, as arsenic, and that arsenic in fairly small dosages is lethal, but it's also possible to build up a little bit of a tolerance towards it, and that Mithridates, in order to protect himself from poisoning, basically continually dosed himself with very small dosages of all of these different poisonous substances, and that this was reputedly a source of long life and vigor in his case, in addition to his ability to not be poisoned when drinking something poisonous. Right? There's the famous scene in the movie The Princess Bride, and it may well be in the book also, although I haven't read that book, where right, the idea is that there are two cups poisoned, and one of the characters has to pick which of the cups is poisoned out of the two cups, and it's revealed that both cups are poisoned. And the Wesley says, I spent the last several years building up a immunity to iocane powder, and so it's that's sort of where that comes from, is Mithridates, or at least one source for that concept. Mithridates' life was pretty chaotic. Part of the material around his concern with poison is presented as a sort of psychological fixation on this, because his father was poisoned by his mother, who basically took over ruling the kingdom as the regent for Mithridates and his younger brother. also named Mithridates, which is confusing. But that's how it goes with royal families sometimes, as well as this being a kind of a classic pursuit of these Hellenistic kings in this period of antiquity, all of the different um, kind of Greco-Persian influenced kingdoms in the Near East that were remnants of the Alexandrian conquests, and so sort of blended cultural elements from both sides. Um, that the idea of this kind of not necessarily philosopher king, but I guess you might say a scientist king was something that was relevant to this culture in this period, and that Mithridates himself really self-consciously um, attempted to emulate a number of the virtues of Alexander, as well as like Cyrus the Great and Darius and Xerxes, and all of these different emulatable figures from history, from both of the kind of um, influencing cultures, I guess you might say, as well as doing a lot of things with other cultures around the Black Sea. So Pontus was a kingdom on the northern coastline of modern day Turkey, bordering the Black Sea. And Mithridates was able to secure some amount of confederation and trading agreements with a number of different kingdoms on the kind of more Greek settled sides of the Black Sea. So in places like Colchis, which is in modern day Georgia, um, or up into kind of the area around on the European side, up on like the coastline of modern day Bulgaria into the Danube River Valley, but also on the north side of the Black Sea in places like modern day Crimea, and obviously um, all of the different territories in um, Ukraine and Russian controlled territories and all that sort of stuff. And that at the time, a lot of this was, for lack of a better term, barbarian, Scythian territory, all of these um, semi nomadic pastoralist kingdoms of very ferocious horse archers, among other things. And that Mithridates was popular with them as a figure of remarkable kind of vigor and valor, and organized a lot of these different kingdoms and different organizations that otherwise probably wouldn't have contributed to the fight against Roman encroachment into the Near East, into a um, remarkably numerous army at the very least. They weren't necessarily very successful in the long term, but they did have a whole bunch of soldiers, and it's an interesting thing that I think Adrienne Mayer pretty much is totally willing to use the numerical assessments from the period sources without a lot of attempts to reconsider them. And I thought that was a kind of an interesting detail about this book. One of the things about Mithridates himself is that almost all of our sources about him and his kingdom in this period and all of that come from Roman sources, from his enemies. And for those of you who have read classical histories, you may well be aware that often the numbers of the enemies facing Roman forces, or Greek forces for that matter, are seemingly significantly inflated. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the ultimate point being that Adrienne Mayer is happy to report that Mithridates had armies of, like 80,000 or 100,000 mercenaries who go up against a force of like 20 or 30,000 Roman legionaries and are fought to a standstill. Instead of, I think, a lot of modern kind of military historians of the period would push back and say, okay, there's just not really a way to support that large of a force on Mithridates' side, and it doesn't really make sense to take the ancient authors directly at their word when we know that force sizes, especially among enemies of the culture that the writer is writing from, are so often heavily inflated. I mean, the obvious example being Herodotus says that Xerxes brings an army of like 2 million soldiers to try to conquer Greece. And then, 2 million soldiers never seem to show up for these big battles. And how does that end up working? Anyway, it's a complicated thing, but I think it is one of the things that is likely to temper enjoyment of this book, at least for me, for my thoughts about it. I think the other big thing is that there are a number of sequences where Adrienne Mayer does a sort of, I guess, historical imagining, which is interesting. Um, Her kind of presentation of the idea of like what something that we can't know anymore with precise detail of what happened, but what it could have been like is, I think, interesting enough to read. And it has its roots really in that classical history, right? That the classical authors are more than happy to share information that they definitely didn't know precisely, but were interested in kind of telling that as part of the story. Um, there's a meme I saw many years ago now that I thought was funny. That was the modern historian searching through pages and pages of like statistical data to try to understand um, price fluctuations in certain goods in a period versus the ancient historian who says something like, I wasn't there, but my brother-in-law had a dream about this event. Let me tell you how it happened. And so there's something really kind of interesting and fun about not the same level of fancy being applied, but this idea of being willing to share at least a potential version of what might have happened in these sequences that often are summarized very, very quickly by the few sources that we have about the period remaining. Many of the sources that we have now access to about the period are not the original histories of those periods, but are later histories written with the benefit of those histories that summarize the material from those accounts that are much closer to the period of the events taking place. And so you end up with, very, very short, a one sentence summary of the events of several months or a year. And it kind of adds something interesting to imagine things in this way. On the other side, I think it is. I think there's a tendency when writing biography often to valorize the subject of the biography um, a- as much as anything because of being kind of intellectually close to them as a person from all of this research and the process of writing. Um, and that's not to say that Mithridates was inherently like a deeply evil person, but I think that the presentation of Mithridates as mostly basically a good person who is doing things that are kind of necessary in his period is an overreaction against the vilification of Mithridates as this, evil hater of Romans and murderer in the night and all that sort of stuff. Because there are some moments where this kind of imagined scene seems to be presented in a way that presents Mithridates really as I think, a more heroic figure than would be a even-handed assessment of him. Basically, especially near the end, there's a couple of sequences that are, I think, present him as much more of a tragic figure, and that's not to say that his ending was not tragic, but he also did like get rid of a bunch of the other members of the royal family through poisonings and assassinations and all this sort of stuff, and clearly, you know, was not necessarily, I mean, hard to say that any major leader in the period was a good person because it would be difficult to be like a warlord and a conqueror and a successful leader of these states in this period of basically like the first century BCE. it would be difficult to be a good person and be the leader of a successful state. And arguably, the person who comes across as maybe the best good person is the leader of the king of Pergamum, who is largely seemingly presented as not very good at ruling and leaves his kingdom to the Romans. And that, he's probably the perfect example in this limited historical period of a leader who is a good person and who is probably not a very good leader. And that therefore it doesn't necessarily seem to me a requirement to present Mithridates as a good person to be interested in him as a historical leader. But it seems like there is an over emphasis on him as a I guess a better person than maybe he deserves, if that makes sense. And that's really I guess a matter of taste in a lot of ways. It's not to say that he you know I guess the reader may well feel differently about that. Um, but yeah, overall, I thought it was pretty good. It's interesting. There's a number of these kind of modern histories written about a specific character who has not seen as much scholarly attention, or a specific period of history that's kind of underrepresented in the literature, all these sorts of things. I'm thinking about, for example, James Rom's Ghost on the Throne, which I think is a better book basically than this one, to be honest. I would read that before this, although I thought The Poison King was pretty good. And if you're interested in Mithridates and the history of his kingdom of Pontus, this is definitely worth checking out. It's a good modern resource for the period if you're interested in that, in a part of the world that does not have kind of nearly enough good scholarship on this material, despite having kind of an outsized um, role in, or an outsized presence as a character in kind of the understanding of the classics since that classical period. Another book that I would recommend is also by Adrienne Mayer, The First Fossil Hunters, which I read it a couple years ago and I thought it was really good. It similarly engages in some of this kind of imaginative historical familiarity, I guess, these imagined scenes from history that are not necessarily provable whether or not they happened, or yeah, are not provable, not recorded, but are kind of interesting as a way to try to engage with and think about how these people thought about the world around them. And The First Fossil Hunters really is, um, it is a book that doesn't have the like guiding spine of narrative that something like The Poison King has. There isn't really a narrative history component of The First Fossil Hunters, but it is really interesting if you're interested in basically a kind of classic question, which is, well, how did people before they knew what fossils were think about fossils? Because they were clearly there, right? This material was definitely still there in the earth. And how did people who lived in a period that is ancient to us think about a period that was even more ancient, is really interesting. And I really liked The First Fossil Hunters a lot because I haven't read it as recently. I'm not going to speak in quite as much detail about it, but I would say totally go check it out. It's a really fun and interesting book that explores not so much a specific period of history that is under discussed, but a sort of concept of historical understanding that I think is really interesting and worth checking out, and ultimately makes the book very worth reading. So, yeah, The Poison King, pretty good. The First Fossil Hunters, maybe even better, I guess, is my kind of final statement on that. I don't think I've read any other books by Adrienne Mayer, but both of those are quite good and totally worth checking out. Um, and yeah, I think I think that's everything for today for this. I think that's enough to give you an idea of whether you will or won't like at least the Poison King, and you'll just kind of have to take my word for it that the first Fossil Hunters is really cool. Anyway, that is going to be it for me for today. I hope you have enjoyed. If you have read The Poison King or The First Fossil Hunters or Ghost on the Throne or any number of other classical history books that you think are really interesting and are worth talking about, let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.